Hello, welcome to our 7th program. This week, we're going to elaborate on our discussion of basic pawn structures and also look at what a positional advantage really is. Oh, by the way, do you remember that fellow I was telling you about that was always blowing his smoke into my face and putting his ashes on the board? I finally fouled him up. I played him a blindfold game, calling out the moves from the next room. He got so bored with not having anyone to intimidate that he resigned at move 10. So you see, there's always a way. This week, we're going to start off by examining most of the basic positions relating to pawn structure. If you add up the sum total of the pawns, they come out to 8 points. And the only piece that's more valuable than them put together is the queen. You mustn't treat the pawns lightly. They can determine the course of a game. If you're looking at this position, you notice black has 3 pawns and white only has 1. And these 3 pawns of black's are very properly placed. But if we would push this middle one up 1 square, if you notice, they become much weaker. It's creating holes. Now, in order for black to push these pawns any further, without the aid of the king or another piece, he must first give one up, because there's nothing supporting them. Then the 2 pawns could be free. So it stands to reason if there's only 2 pawns, it's even stronger for white that this position occurs. There are many different types of pawn relationships to look out for during a game. For instance, if you are both castled on the king side, and white has the majority of pawns on the queen side, it stands to reason that this would be an advantage, because it takes time for the kings to get over to the other side of the board. So if white was far enough advanced in his pawn structure and had a strong pawn structure, he could force a passed pawn quicker, or nearly as quick as the king could get over to defend the passed pawn. A passed pawn is when there is nothing, no other pawn in front of the pawn stopping it from proceeding. As this is a passed pawn, and it can queen. And that is the threat that we are trying to avoid in relation to pawns at all times. Now, from the start of the game, each pawn move should be directed towards putting pressure on a central square and then supporting the chain or the line of pawns which you've established. In a structure like this, or like this, always pushing forward. Pawns can be used to occupy space, to defend pieces at key outposts so that they cannot be chased away, to queen if you can get them to the 8th square, and to blockade your opponent from being able to attack. When you have rooks on the board, you attempt to control open files. For as you see here, this rook stops the king from crossing anywhere in this line to come over and work with his pawns on the other side. This is called an open file. It is very important to control open files, especially if they're central ones. When you have a pawn, one pawn, on a file, and a rook is attacking it, it is said that white controls the half-open file, because there is one pawn gone. If there are 2 pawns on the file, it is a closed file. With my white pawn gone, it's half open for me. If this white pawn was there and the black one was gone, it's half open for black. Taking control of it, though, is another matter. So when you have an open file, both sides generally strain and thrive to control this file because it's very important. The same with ranks, as we were discussing the 7th rank being an important rank to control. Any rank can be, depending on the situation. Pawns, on the other hand, must always work in conjunction with each other. They must work in unison. As we said before, an isolated pawn like this is very weak because it takes a piece to defend it. A doubled isolated pawn is even worse because it cannot be supported from behind by a rook. This pawn is very easily attacked. Doubled pawns of any nature, whether they're isolated or not, are considered bad because, in a sense, it's like having one pawn. It's almost like being a pawn down, except possibly in certain situations, as in controlling the center, they can be of an advantage because they make for a strong center. But these situations are very limited, and doubled pawns should generally be avoided as well as isolated pawns. And as we saw before, this pawn structure like this is much stronger than a pawn structure of this nature. So when you want to attack this pawn at the end of a chain, you must always look to the base. The base of this pawn chain in both directions is here. Therefore, since there is only one base defending two pawn chains, it is weak because it's easily attacked and the pawn structure in the chain falls. Whereas here, there are two bases and it's very difficult to attack the central pawn. When pawns are moving in relation to each other in such a fashion, you must always try to think ahead to see what will happen if various exchanges are made and try to avoid weak positions. Like this position here is much stronger for white than it is for black. Of course he has an extra pawn, but even if he didn't, it would still be stronger. Because black's base of the pawn chain is here, and it's much more easily attacked if there are other pieces on the board. And white is much more freer to advance his pawns in this position than black is. Now, you see, if black takes, he is left with an isolated pawn. So it would not be good for him to take. Since black has hopelessly bungled his pawn position at this point, the only chance he has now is to try to bring his king into play. And white, of course, doesn't have to do anything with his pawns at this point, but rather he does the same in bringing his king in. And you see, as the kings are fighting and jockeying for position, white leaves the tension with the pawns as long as possible until he can move with tempo. Check. Now black is forced to retreat more, and white can eventually gain tempos. Now, if black moves to either side, the king will come in. So rather than do that, he moves his pawn. Now white does the same. Black is forced to take. He cannot defend the pawn. This game will go on for quite some time, but white will eventually secure a win because he has achieved an isolated pawn for black, and he can take advantage of it. He has control of space. A little easy way of figuring out how you can catch a pawn, if you can, before it queens, is simply by drawing a square from wherever the pawn is to the queening square and out to either side. And if your opponent's king is within this square or can move into it in the next move, he can stop the pawn from queening. That's all there is to it. Now that I've shown you some of the basics of how the pawns work and relate in the endgame, let's see how they affect the openings. Moving up here to our big board, And we'll take a standard opening. The gioco piano. This is a variation that you haven't seen yet. It's very simple and very repetitious. White's castling here is a bit premature, and black decides to pin this knight against the queen. Now, one of the main reasons why this knight is really pinned, and so is the queen pinned to the defense of this knight, unless he brings another piece into play to defend it, is that if he moves away, the bishop can now take the knight, forcing white to recapture, and in so doing, he doubles his pawns and also weakens his king side. This is not good for white. This is an idea in the openings that is used quite often. You can threaten not just the capture of a piece or of a pawn, but you can threaten to gain an advantage in position, like doubling an opponent's pawns or isolating an opponent's pawns. Like in this situation, white is really at a loss. Probably his best move is to defend the knight with another knight to open up his game more. But even though he restricts his bishop somewhat in doing so. If he tries to push on the bishop, attacking it with a pawn, which is not a good trade for black, making him move it, in this particular position, black doesn't have to move it. He can use a pawn to defend it. Because if white takes the bishop with the pawn, black recaptures, and in so doing, opens up the rook. Open file, right down attacking the king, and also black's pawn is now attacking white's knight. In this position, black has the offensive. He has the advantage of time and of space, not of material, but he will, sooner or later, gain an advantage in the position. His bishop is strategically placed, his pawn structure is solid, and his game is quite free. White must now move this knight, otherwise lose it, giving back the advantage. And when he does, black pushes this little pawn right down on white. And if you notice, this pawn here of white's is pinned. It can't move because of the bishop. It would be putting himself in check. Now this is really frustrating for white. He has a rook coming right down on his weak squares. He has a pawn and a bishop attacking bishop 2, which is another weak square, and the queen and the knight and everything prone and ready for action. And white's pieces, underdeveloped and misplaced, easy to be taken advantage of. So you see, proper handling of the pawn situation is important. Well, I hope you're going to use your pawns to the most advantage in the games coming up this week. And I hope you enjoy playing chess a lot. Good night.